I hope that this is going to work out properly. This is January 29th, and we are in the book of James in our General Epistles class. We want to continue with that study this morning, and we will be getting into the question of faith and works. But here, as we were looking at James, the second chapter, we see in this first section of the second chapter how that they were showing respect to persons, and we noted in verse 9 when they do that, then it will, thank you, Ted, it does show that, so I must have it right for once. When they show respect to persons to someone, then that becomes sin, and they are condemned by that royal law, which teaches them that they are not to do such, that they are to love their fellow man. In verse 10, he then says, "For whosoever shall keep the whole law, and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all." So here we are dealing with the law of Moses, as we see specifically in verse 11 when he says, "For he that saith, do not commit adultery, also said, do not kill." Well, those are dealing with the law of Moses. Offend is from the Greek word petao, and it means to stumble or fall. And thus he's dealing with sin. That individual who offends, who sins, is what he's dealing with. It does not state here that he violates all of the law. Some people have tried to almost make it that way, that, well, if you commit one thing, then you violated all of the law. No, he's guilty of all of the law. There's a difference between the two aspects. Guilty is from the Greek word enokos, and it is to be under obligation or bound, to be liable to. Strong's defines it as denoting the connection of a person either with his crime or with the penalty or trial, or with that against whom or which he has offended. That would be the way in which Strong's defines this idea. And thus he is guilty, or he is worthy of punishment, is what he's dealing with. He has offended, he has sinned, and thus he is guilty, or he's worthy of punishment because he has violated the law. Does that mean he's violated every command in the law? No, he has violated the law, and thus he's guilty of punishment because he has violated the law. And thus, in that sense, it is as if he had violated all of the law, because he stands condemned by all of the law. The lesson that we need to learn on this is that all of God's laws are important. We don't have the right to keep the ones that we want to, and then to ignore ones that we don't like or that we don't want. A good illustration, I think, of this would be two aspects of the law of Christ today. We, within the Lord's church, emphasize, and rightly so, the necessity of being baptized for the forgiveness of our sins. Well, if we want to keep that, we have that wish to keep that one, but then how many times do we see individuals and congregations refusing to withdraw fellowship based upon the commands that God has given unto us? Well, how in the world can we do that? We don't have the right to pick baptism and say, okay, we'll keep baptism. And then to look at the other side and say, oh no, I don't want to withdraw fellowship from this individual, so I'm not going to do that. We do not have that right. there's one other thing that I think important in relationship to this is to guard against the aspect of saying, well, since I cannot live the Christian life sinlessly, there's no use in becoming a Christian. I might as well forget about it, give it up, because I'm weak and sinful. I'm going to do these things wrong, and so I might as well forget about it because I can't keep all of the law perfectly or sinlessly. Well, we need to guard against that as well. That's not what he's saying here, and that's not what he's dealing with. He's dealing with that attitude of, well, I'll keep one aspect, and especially in respect to persons. I will love this individual over here because that individual is one that I want to love. But this individual over here, he's not one that's really all that lovable. And so I'm going to ignore him. I'm going to treat him evil. I don't have the right to be a judge like unto that. Verse 11, thus he says, For he that saith, Do not commit adultery, said also, Do not kill. Now if thou commit no adultery, yet if thou kill, thou art become a transgressor of the law. So here is an illustration of the principle that he's just stated. Both of these laws, do not commit adultery and do not kill, came from the same lawgiver, which is God. They both came from God. And thus, because they came from the same lawgiver, or they both came from God, we are under one of the laws just as much as we are under the other law. And whatever portion one violates is thus transgression. And the word transgression here is the same word as transgressors in verse 9. You're guilty of transgression. Transgressor of the law, same word. And you are guilty of transgression. You have violated or transgressed the law because both of them are God's word. They are both the will of the one God. This also shows us that there is an equality in the law. As far as God is concerned, one sin is just as evil as any other sin. You can't say that there's any of these big sins and then little sins. And as long as we don't commit these big sins, it's all right if we commit the little sins. No, it's not. Sin is sin in that respect. Now, I realize that the effects of sin might be greater in relationship to one sin as opposed to another sin. But as far as God is concerned, sin is sin. And there's no distinction along that line. If you keep several things and then simply don't keep another area, then you're still guilty of violating or offending the law just as if you refuse to do all of it. And that's the emphasis that is being given here. It's interesting to me also here, the order of the laws that are given. Here in verse 11, do not commit adultery, then do not kill. This follows the order of the Septuagint translation instead of the Hebrew order that we would normally find, which the Hebrew order, you have thus the seventh before the sixth. But that's the way it is in the Septuagint. And, of course, the Septuagint translation is a translation of the Hebrew into the Greek. It was the common Bible of that time, both for Jews and everyone else that followed the Old Testament. That was the Bible, the oracles of God that they used. Verse 12, then, he says, So speak ye, and so do, as they that shall be judged by the law of liberty. In all of our conduct, how we live, what we have said, what we have done, we act under the constant impression that one day we're going to be judged. We are going to, and we have to have authority from God for all that we do and say. And specifically, Jesus states in Matthew 12, 36 and 37, that we're going to be judged by what we say. And Colossians 3 and verse 17 would indicate both our actions and everything that we do, both what we say and what we do. So we are going to be judged by what we do. We're going to be judged by the law of liberty that he specifies here. Notice that this is the law of liberty, and it goes back really to James 1, verse 25, and not the royal law of James 2 and verse 8, which is interesting. Because in that royal law, which he is specifying within this context, is that law that comes from the Old Testament. And now then James changes that to say you're going to be judged by the law of liberty, not the law, that royal law. Law of liberty or the New Testament. It is a law of liberty in that it leads to freedom. A freedom for those who were at one time slaves to sin, and thus the New Testament law. It is a law, but it is not a law that allows us to do what we want to, or situation ethics. I can do whatever I want to as long as it does not hurt others. And within the context of here, within this, the law of love, you have that aspect that's being discussed here. And he's showing you're going to be judged by the law of liberty, not this law of love. That would be situation ethics view. We're going to be judged by the law of love, not by the law of liberty. And that's the way that a lot of people view it within our society today. I'm going to be judged by the law of liberty, or excuse me, the law of love, that royal law, not the law of liberty. While many affirm that, James affirms we're going to be judged by the New Testament standard, that law of liberty. And if we offend that law of liberty, if we sin against it, then we're going to stand condemned by it. In verse 13 then, James is going to show us the certainty of judgment. For he shall have judgment without mercy, that hath showed no mercy, and mercy rejoiceth against judgment. It does show the certainty of judgment, and we know that we're going to be judged. Paul discusses that in Acts 17 and verse 31. We know it because there is a resurrected Christ, because there was an empty tomb about 2,000 years ago. But it also shows us that when mercy is shown, then at the judgment there will be mercy. When there's no mercy shown, then at the judgment there's not going to be mercy shown. Mercy is very simply godliness to those in distress. And within the context, going back to verse 2, they should have shown mercy to that poor man. They did toward the rich man. They should have been showing it toward the poor man, but they didn't. They showed no mercy. And this really should humble us in our dealings with others. When we consider the mercy that I show to others is the mercy that I'm going to receive by God, that should affect us as to how we are going to treat each other in our daily lives, and how we show mercy, godliness to those who are in distress. There's a lot of passages throughout the Scriptures, and just to mention a few of them, Psalm 18 and verse 25, Matthew 5 and verse 7, Matthew 6 verse 12, and then verses 14 and 15, Matthew 7 verses 1 and 2, Matthew 18 and verse 35, and you go back really to that entire context starting in verse 23 and going through verse 35, Matthew 25 verses 41 through 46, Galatians 6 and verse 7. All of these passages and many more shows us an attitude of mercy that we should be showing to others. Mercy in the first century, though, was a characteristic that was almost unknown. In fact, the Romans considered any expression of mercy or kindness to others to be unmanly. They considered it a flaw of character, a character flaw. And so they didn't show mercy to others. What a stark contrast Christianity was, and the aspect of Christianity, you show mercy to others, to what people saw in their dealings with, and in particular the Romans, but in reality the entirety of the world at that time. And then mercy rejoiceth against judgment is the principle on which judgment is going to take place. Where mercy can express itself, it always transcends judgment, or it's superior to judgment. Mercy cancels out judgment or condemnation. And that's what James is saying here. And so you need to be showing mercy to others so that we can receive mercy from God. Hazel, I'm not sure what you mean by that comment. I need to send out or a minute. Is that, do you mean the word sin there or something else? I'll continue on, though, and you can put that in. Now then, we enter into the latter part of this second chapter. And this is a section that has brought about a great deal of controversy. Luther called the book of James an epistle of straw, or a white straw epistle, because of this section. It is that a man declares his faith by his works, in verses 14 through 26. The reason that Luther called James this epistle of straw is because of this false doctrine that is in the religious world today of salvation by faith only. And also, when you tie in with that, a misunderstanding of what Paul taught in passages such as Romans 4, verses 1 and 2, Ephesians 2, verses 8 and verse 9, and other passages. But a closer look at these passages shows that Paul and James really harmonize. And I want to take a little bit of time and show the harmony between Paul and James, and how that Paul stresses the importance of faith, as James does, and both Paul and James stress the importance of works. However, Paul and James, and I'll add this as we start this, discuss two different types of works, and we'll notice that in just a moment. But Paul's works are excluded from God's plan to save. They are basically meritorious in nature, a work in which a person could glory in, while James' works are included in God's plan and are commanded by God and essential to salvation. They are works that perfect faith. Now then, let's go back and notice this section of James, and then basically what we'll want to deal with is what Paul writes in Romans, for example, 3, verse 38, chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, and verse 6, and what he writes in Romans 11 and verse 6, along with other places. But what we see in Paul's teaching first, the importance or the necessity of faith. Look at Paul's teachings, Acts 13, verse 38 and 39. And because of time element, I'm not going to copy all these into the chat room, but Acts 13, 38 and 39, we are justified by faith. In Acts 16, verse 30 and 31, he shows that we are saved by faith. In Romans 1, verse 16 and 17, again, we are saved by faith and the fact that the just live by faith. In Romans 5 and verse 1, he shows that we are justified by faith. Romans 14 and verse 23, whatever is not of faith is sin. There, of course, the faith that he is talking about is not the faith, the Word of God. Instead, it's one's own personal conscience, though. But whatever is not of thus personal faith is sin. In Ephesians 2 and verse 8, we are saved by grace through faith. Hebrews 11 and verse 6. and yes, I believe that Paul is the author of the Hebrew letter, he says without faith it's impossible to please God. So in order to please God, you have to have faith. There's the necessity of faith in Paul's teaching. Other inspired penmen also teach the importance of faith. John, in John 3 and verse 16, you have to have faith or belief for eternal life. John 20, verse 30 and 31, you have to have belief for life. Peter, as he's speaking to Cornelius in Acts 10 and verse 43, you have to believe for the remission of sins. In Acts 15 and verse 9, you must be purified, or you are purified by faith. In 1 John 5, verse 1 and verse 4, you have to believe to be born of God and to overcome the world. But also, when we're looking at the importance or the necessity of faith, James also gives the same emphasis. James 1, verse 3 and verse 6, James 2 and verse 1, James 2 and verse 18 and verse 23 within this specific section, and also James 5 and verse 15. Some individuals come along, though, and will say, well, why so little teaching about faith in the book of James? Well, number one, I want to give three answers to that. Number one, the epistle is not devoted to the subject or the theme of faith. And so there's going to be a little amount of teaching on that subject. He does bring it up, he does show the importance of it, but it's not devoted to that subject or that theme. Second, James is a relatively small book, and so by the very nature of the size of the book of James, you're not going to have a great deal of teaching in relationship to that subject. And then if you want to make a comparison, simply compare Galatians and the teachings of faith in Galatians or the teaching of faith in the book of Philippians as illustrations in relationship to the book of James. And in that way you would be comparing more apples to apples instead of apples to oranges. So there is the importance of faith that is shown in these. Scriptures also emphasize the importance of works or deeds. Some general teachings along this line. Excuse me. Matthew 5 and verse 16. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works. John 6, verse 28 and 29. They ask, what shall we work to do the works of God, or what must we do to work the works of God? And Jesus says to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. So belief is shown to be a work of God. Work of God is basically there a work which God has given man or instructed man to do. 1 Peter 1 and verse 17. God is going to judge every man according to his works. Revelation 2 and verse 26. Revelation 20 and verse 12 and 13. In that scene of the judgment, we're going to be judged by what we do, our works. So there is also throughout the Scriptures a general teaching of the importance of our works or our deeds. Now then, man's difficulty oftentimes arises from a misunderstanding of works or obedience, or the word maybe performance of duty. There are different aspects of works or application of works that you need to consider within the Scriptures. There is, for example, the works of the law of Moses. That's what Paul is stating in Romans 3 and verse 28. He's dealing with the works of the law of Moses. He is making a contrast between the law of Moses, which was a law of works, with the law of Christ, which he says is a law of faith. The law of works there, though, is he is applying that to the law of Moses. We are not saved by the works of the law of Moses. We have been delivered from that law. We cannot be saved by those works of the law of Moses. That's really how Paul uses the idea of works throughout Romans. And many people lose sight of that. Also, Galatians, you see the same aspect. And if you look at Galatians 2 and verse 16 in particular, Galatians, again, is showing the cessation of the law of Moses for the New Testament law of Christ. And the works demanded under the law of Moses have been abolished. We are not going to be justified by the works of the law. But it's dealing with the law of Moses. We cannot be justified by those works. Second, works deals with the works of man. You have the works of the law of Moses. You have the works of man. This is how Paul is using it in Ephesians 2, verses 8 and verse 9. It is not of yourselves. That is, there are works which man might devise to save himself, but those will not save. Those would be if you could devise your own works and do those things to save yourself. Well, that would be works in which you could boast. You could say, I've done this. I have earned my salvation. And Paul says thus, it's not of yourselves, not of your own works. Titus 3 and verse 5, not by works which we have done. Well, that would be, again, works of man, works which we have done. It's the works which we would devise to save ourselves. Man cannot devise any works by which to save himself. But then there's also, in a third category, works of the New Testament law of Christ. For example, Acts the 10th chapter and verse 34 and 35. Everyone to be accepted by God must work righteousness. But we find that righteousness is the keeping of the law. Romans 1, 16 and 17 are the keeping of the gospel. The gospel is God's power to save. It reveals the righteousness of God to us. Well, thus, righteousness is found within the gospel of Jesus Christ. He that doeth righteousness, John writes, 1 John 3 and verse 7, is righteous. Thus, righteousness is the keeping of the gospel. In order to be accepted by God, what do you have to do? You have to keep the gospel. John 6, verse 28 and 29. You have that question relating to the works of God. What must we do to do the works of God? And they're not dealing with here works out of the law of Moses. He's not dealing with the works of man. In other words, what they are dealing with and asking Jesus, what must we do that God would have us to do to be saved? And we might add, saved through Jesus Christ. And the work which God has devised for man to be saved is to believe on Jesus. Now then, when we look at this aspect of works in relationship, works to the New Testament law of Christ, we see that Paul is in agreement with these things. Romans 1 and verse 5, there's obedience of faith. In other words, the faith demands obedience to it. That is, works. Romans 2 and verse 6, you have deeds. Well, the word deeds is translated elsewhere as works. Romans 7 and verse 4, bring forth fruit or good works is the teaching that is set forth there. You bring forth good works. Romans 16 and verse 26, again, you have the obedience of the faith. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 58, you abound in the work of the Lord, so that your labor is not in vain. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 10, you have a work of the Lord that is demanded in the New Testament age. Galatians 5 and verse 6, a faith which works by love. Well, that's exactly what James is saying. Ephesians 2, verses 8 through 10. A lot of people want to just quote verse 8 and verse 9 and leave out verse 10. We are saved by works that God has ordained. We are not saved by works which we devise, but which God has ordained, that we should walk in them. Philippians 2 and verse 12, Paul says, we are to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. In 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 3, and in chapter 2 and verse 3, you have the same thing. And then when we turn to James, James is in complete agreement with what Paul has written and what others have written regarding the works of the law of Christ, the works of the New Testament law that we have to be obedient to in order to be saved. And that's this section here. And let me also add real briefly here in relationship to what James is saying. He uses two illustrations. The first illustration is Abraham, which would apply to the Christian. You have to, as a Christian, do the works of the New Testament law in order to be saved. When you're dealing with the second illustration, Rahab, though, that would be an application to the non-Christian. You have to do the works of the New Testament law in order to be saved. That would be saved as one who is a non-Christian in order to be saved from your past sins and thus become a Christian. Let me add here, and we're not going to go into any detail on this, but when you're dealing with the word works in the Bible, we've mentioned the works of the law of Moses, we've mentioned the works of man, and the works of the New Testament law. There's also works of the devil that are found in the Bible. There's works of the flesh that's found in the Bible. There's also works of physical sustenance. In other words, we work so that we can earn a living to feed our family. So all of those are works that are found within the Bible, and we very simply need to understand the context of works as it is being used by the specific writer. How is he using this word works? Is he using it for the law of Moses? Is he using it for man's works that he would devise to save himself? Is he using it for the works of physical sustenance? Is he using it for the works of the devil? Is he using it for the works of the New Testament law that God has commanded us that we must do in order to be saved? That's how James is using works. And thus, James, and we titled this section here, coming back to chapter 2, verse 14 through 26, that the proven man, the proven Christian, declares his faith by his works. Now then, and I know I ran over that real quickly, and I hope that you're able to get all of it, but this is and will be saved on the website, so you will have access to be able to go back to it if you missed any of those verses. But now then, let's turn to this section, verse 14. James says, "What does it profit, my brethren, though a man say he hath faith, and have not works? Can faith save him?" Profit is from the Greek word ophelios, and it means an advantage, and here, as used in this context, denotes good. What good is it? A man here makes the claim of having faith, and the word say in the Greek is in the present tense, which shows that he continues to say. It's in the subjunctive mood. That's the mood of potentiality and possibility. So if a man, it is a conditional sentence thus. And he is asking really, or this is a rhetorical question that's expecting a negative answer. If a man should simply continue to say that he has faith, but he doesn't have works, what good is it? What advantage is it? What good is it for him? It will do that individual absolutely no good. It will not be to his profit or to his advantage, simply to be proclaiming that he has faith if he does not have work. And James is not saying here that faith will not save. Notice the latter part of that. Can faith save him? He's not saying there that faith cannot save. He's not trying to denigrate in any way, shape, or form faith. He is saying the faith that he is discussing, the faith that is without works, that faith will not save him. And in the Greek, it literally is, can that faith save him? And of course the answer there is no. That type of faith, faith without works, cannot save anyone. Verse 15 thus, if a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you say unto them, depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding ye give them not those things which are needful to the body, what doth it profit? This really goes back to verse 2 and verse 6. Here's a man who comes into your assembly who's naked, he's destitute. And now then, within these two verses, he's giving really an example of faith without works of obedience. Here's the word naked does not mean he is without any clothing at all. I think a good study sometimes, and one that we need to go into, is a study of naked within the Bible. What does it really mean? Does it mean without any clothing whatsoever? Absolutely not. The word naked is without sufficient clothing. Or in this case, it might even be a lack of a particular article of clothing that he has need of. In other words, what he is saying here within this context, here's an individual who comes into you and he's in the worst of possible situations. And I would say in regards to the word naked, if you do a study of naked within the Scriptures, you'll see that God considers someone naked who's really, if they're not clothed from the neck area or the shoulders or above the shoulders all the way to the knee. And when you start showing the thigh, when you start laying down on the top, then God places that in the category of being naked when those things are done. Thus, what we would see in our society today, most people, or many people, would be considered naked according to the Bible standard. And thus, that maybe give us a little bit of insight when you turn over to 1 Timothy, the 2nd chapter, in relationship to being dressed modestly. What is it? We'll do a study of what nakedness is as defined by God. But here he's using it, he's without sufficient clothing, or he does not have a particular article of clothing that he has need of, and thus he's in the worst of situation. In verse 16 he goes on to say, one of you saying to them, by this phrase, one of you saying to them, it is saying, let us be done with the matter at once. It's showing someone who does not care. He wants to get on to something that's more important, is the attitude that is being expressed here. And so he says, depart in peace. The word, or that phrase, depart in peace, is a usual Jewish expression of farewell. Basically, and it's a present imperative, which would indicate or be translated, keep on departing in peace. And the aspect of an imperative is, it is a command. You depart, you keep on departing in peace. You leave, you go on. But it also, he says, be warmed and filled. Really, the English doesn't carry out the Greek because he is saying to them, you get yourselves warmed and filled. You go out, and it's kind of like our attitude a lot of times with poor people. Go get a job. Don't bother me. You go get a job, and you work and earn your own living when they're in need. Now, I know and I realize that there's a lot of bums in our society who try to feed off of the goodness of other individuals, and that's not the type of person that I'm dealing with, nor is James dealing with. Paul deals with them in 2 Thessalonians 3 when he says, if man doesn't work, neither let him eat. But here's someone who has an actual need. He's coming, he doesn't have food, he does not have the proper clothing, and your attitude, he's dealing with our attitude, not dealing with so much the other individual here. Our attitude is, you go get a job. You go get yourself warmed and filled. Don't bother me. I've got to get over here to something more important. and thus you don't give them what is necessary. You don't give, they have that which is needful for the body, in this case, is food and clothing. And all you're doing is substituting the food and clothing with empty words. And again, James is using a rhetorical question that expects a negative response. Will it do any good? No. That doesn't do any good. By failing to give them the necessities, it shows that our good wishes are meaningless and heartless. You go on, get yourself a job, you be warmed and filled. That's right. It shows our attitude of heartlessness. But also he's using this as an illustration of faith without works. What good was it to that individual to tell him, go get a job, be warmed and filled, and yet we don't even help him out. We don't give him that which is needful. We don't give him the food and the clothing. Now, we could also look at that from the aspect, and we won't take the time to look at from the aspect of benevolence. We need to be a benevolent people. God teaches us that, and yes, the church is to be benevolent. There are certain needs for the body that are necessary for the body, and the church is obligated, yes, under obligation, to fulfill those physical needs at times for those individuals. Now then, verse 17, he is going to make an application of what he stated in verse 15 and 16. Even so, faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. So now then he's returning he's returning to this theme of verse 14. And verses 15 and 16, an illustration, there is no profit in faith without works. Now then, again, the works that James is dealing with here are the works that God has commanded, and they are a demonstration of one's faith. Faith without works are dead, they're incomplete. The word alone is from actually two Greek words. In the Greek it is literally kathutane. And it comes from the first of those, kata, which is down, and then huto, the last word there, self, and it indicates thus by itself. Here is something by itself. It's alone. It's by itself. If faith does not produce love and mercy, then it's by itself. It's not true faith. That which is true faith, alive faith, is going to produce effects. Now, the lesson is that we are going to prove our good wishes for others by deeds of mercy and goodwill to them. There's the application, or there's the teaching in verse 15 and 16. In relationship to faith, we prove our faith when we are obedient to Him who prompts to faith. Verse 18 then, you might have an objector to what James is saying. Yea, a man may say, Thou hast faith, and I have works. Show me thy faith without thy works, and I will show thee my faith by my works. So here's an objector to what James is saying. The objector says and argues, well, one person emphasizes faith, another person emphasizes works. Each of these are good and effective, and neither one of them should be minimized, is what he's saying. And so if one shows his piety, his religion, in one way over the other way, both of them are good and wholesome and right, and you cannot denigrate one to the other. And this objector is saying one's piety is not demonstrated in the same way. Don't we do that a lot of times? We are all to preach the gospel. We are all to be preachers. But some say, oh, I can't do that. I can't go out and teach the gospel to others. That's what the preacher's for. Isn't that a lot of times what we hear within the church today? I'll do this and this and this, and let the preacher do that. That's the attitude of this objector. He's trying to express the same thing in relationship to faith and works. Don't denigrate one. You have your works, I have my faith, and so both of them are necessary and important. You can't say that I am not right and I'm not doing right because I have faith. But faith actually and literally cannot be seen. No matter what you do, you cannot see faith, except its existence is evidenced only through the work that it produces. And so these two are interrelated. Faith and works are related and cannot exist long without one without the other. If you have faith and you don't have works, faith isn't going to really exist. If you have works but you don't have faith, it's not going to exist. They're interrelated. You cannot separate them. And one who puts down works must appeal to the works to prove that he has any faith. The works show his faith. Now, in verse 19, he goes on to say, Thou believest that there is one God, thou doest well. The devils also believe and tremble. The Greek reads as does the ASV here, Thou believest that God is one, instead of, as the King James puts it, Thou believest there is one God. So it is literally that God is one. Belief here that he's dealing with, that James is dealing with here, is simply mental assent that God is one. And we could, and won't go into a study of it, but the three personalities, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, that God is one. And so it's dealing with his existence, that God is one and that God does exist. But here, faith is exclusive of obedience. There are no works of obedience that are being discussed here. So James is, in this context, is still speaking to the objector of verse 18. That person who says, well, I have faith, you have works, so we're both all right. And James is not here denigrating the necessity of faith, even the aspect of simply mental assent. That mental assent, that type of faith is necessary for salvation. That's the aspect, for example, Mark 16 and verse 16. He that believeth what? That's a mental assent that God exists and that Jesus Christ died for my sins. But there's also something that has to go with that to be saved. And James is not denigrating that type of faith. He's saying, by itself, though, it's worthless. Even though this belief is necessary in and of itself, it is not sufficient to save anyone. And he's going to show the demons have this type of faith as well. I see, though, that it's time for our break. So we'll go ahead and stop here and then have about a 10-minute break and then pick up at the top of the hour.